There's a handout for the paper that I'm going to present, and so the paper addresses the question of how philosophy has to think of experience or perception at all in order to understand that this can be a source of knowledge. So it's less addressing the topic whether experience can play any role in philosophy, but so to say a question before how philosophy has to think on experience in order to understand experience to be a source of knowledge at all. And here's the suggestion that I'm going to present. In the foundations of empirical knowledge, Aya asks, why may we not say that we are directly aware of material things? As becomes clear in the following text, Aya does not intend to raise a real question here that he then seeks to answer. For Aya, the answer is obvious. He considers it to be the correct and natural starting point of a large part of modern philosophy, Cartesian as well as empiricist. I quote, the answer is provided by what is known as the argument from illusion, end of quote. This argument shows Aya thinks that it is impossible for us to have immediate consciousness of material objects. Because this argument is widely known, he thinks it suffices to mention it in order then to state the real task of epistemology. That task is to make intelligible how empirical knowledge is possible, even though we have no immediate consciousness of material objects. Aya's way of dealing with the epistemological issue has been paradigmatic in the epistemological tradition up to today. Epistemology, most noticeably where it is concerned with perceptual knowledge, is shaped by the idea that the argument from illusion is its foundation, that it is not one of its objects which requires scrutiny. In what follows, I will question the argument from illusion. I hope to show that the argument from illusion is not compelling. There is an alternative to the Cartesian model of perception, according to which we can have immediate consciousness of material objects without having to deny that we are from time to time victims of illusion. The argument from illusion is supposed to show that we cannot have immediate consciousness of material objects. By immediate consciousness of a material object, we understand a certain kind of knowledge of this object, knowledge that we gain through sensory consciousness of the object, and that is not mediated by an inference. So immediate consciousness of a material object is sensory, non-inferential knowledge of this object. The argument wants to show that immediate consciousness in this sense is impossible. Descartes puts the argument as follows. It happens that we imagine certain things during our nocturnal rest, for example, that we sit wearing a robe by the fire, when in fact we are lying undressed between the sheets. If we think about these things more attentively, we have to recognize, Descartes says, so plainly that being awake and dreaming can never be distinguished by certain criteria. That being awake and dreaming can never be distinguished by certain criteria is supposed to mean that there are cases for us in which we do not perceive anything, namely those in which we are dreaming and so on, which we cannot distinguish by means of a criterion from the cases in which we are perceiving something. But if such a distinction by means of a criterion is impossible for the subject, then this means, says Descartes, that we have to admit, not because of lack of consideration or levity, but because of reasons valid and meditated on, end of quote, that it is inconceivable how we could ever know anything through our senses. Why do we have to admit that? It may seem so. For one can only know something if one has sufficient grounds for believing what one believes, and one has grounds for a belief only if one knows of these grounds. If I do not know that I have grounds to believe P, then I have no grounds to believe P. Now the argument from illusion observes that there can be cases in which a subject does not perceive anything and which it cannot distinguish by means of a criterion from a case in which it does perceive something. But if there can be cases like that, so the argument goes, this shows that it is impossible for me to know in any situation whether my sensory experience is in fact a perception. And since only what I know can be a ground on which I know something, that I perceive something cannot be the ground on which I know that which I perceive. The best possible ground I can have to believe something consists not in my perceiving something, but only in its seeming to me like I am perceiving something. This means that I never have a ground that guarantees that the belief I base upon it is true. So that is the reasoning of the argument from illusion. The honorable motive of the argument from illusion is to explain knowledge in a way that accounts for the possibility of error. The argument from illusion believes that it has to conclude from that no one can ever be in a situation in which she can appeal to a sensory experience as establishing the truth of her judgment. One cannot rule out error as a matter of principle for perceptual judgments. But does it follow that the best possible foundation of a belief is a sensory experience, one's having, which is compatible both with the belief's being true and with its being false? What forces us to deny that we can, from time to time, be in the position of being immediately consciousness of a material object? Let us look at the argument this time from the perspective of its motive. You are now on paragraph 1 on your handout. So the first claim of the defender of the argument from illusion says judgments that are based on experiences have to be able to be true or false. And second, one knows only if one can rule out that one's judgment is false. Now the skeptic argues, third, it follows from 1 that the best possible foundation of an empirical judgment is a sensory experience that is compatible with the falsity of the judgment. Fourth, it follows that the condition 2 places on knowledge cannot, in principle, be met. Empirical knowledge is impossible. So as Mario has argued, to solve the skeptical paradox, we have to give up claim 2. So, and what I'm arguing is to say that claim 2 is correct. So, so I will argue that the skeptical conclusion is valid if 3 is valid, and I will question 3. So, is 3 valid? So there seems to be another, much simpler explanation for the possibility of error, as it is stated in claim 3. Someone can make mistaken empirical judgments when she has sensory experiences that are not veridical perceptions, but only seem to her like veridical perceptions. If someone, on the other hand, has a veridical perception, then this perception is what enables her to know what she perceives. According to this simple, sometimes called disjunctivist explanation, the possibility of error is grounded in the fact that there are 2 cases of sensory experiences, those that constitute immediate knowledge of a material object, and those by which we do not have knowledge and which lead us, if we do not recognize them as such, to a false judgment. Let us call the former good sensory experiences and the latter bad sensory experiences. In order to explain the possibility of error, we now do not need an elaborate theory according to which our knowledge of material objects always requires further considerations, for example about the causal relation between the object and the sensory perception, or about the circumstances of the perceptual situation, on the basis of which we infer from our sensory experience to the object. It suffices to admit that there can be good and bad sensory experiences. And of course only the good ones deliver us knowledge. The argument from illusion does not take this simple explanation of the possibility of error into account. Why not? Crispin Wright puts the objection thus. You find the objection on paragraph 3 on your handout. The simple explanation presupposes that I can know, at least in some cases, that I have a good sensory experience and not a bad one. For only then can this explanation explain how I can acquire knowledge by way of sensory experience. But how can I know that? So how can I know that I'm sitting on the good side of the disjunction and not on the bad side? Obviously not by being able to distinguish good and bad sensory experiences by means of a criterion. Good and bad sensory experiences have to be indistinguishable for me if error is to be possible. If there were a criterion, error would be excluded in principle. But if this is so, it means that the only claim that I can ever justify is that I either have a good sensory experience or a bad one. But I am, as a matter of principle, right, objects unable to know which arm of the disjunction is true. So Wright wants to say, I have to know if my perception is veridical in order to have empirical knowledge. But this I cannot know if error is to be possible. But why? Why is not the simple model valid here too? Whether I have a veridical perception or an illusory one is something I know, in the good case, by having a veridical perception. Thus, McDowell argued against Wright's objection. You find the quotation on paragraph 4. The point of the disjunctive conception, I quote, is that if one undergoes an experience that belongs on the good side of the disjunction, that warrants one in believing that things are as the experience reveals them as being. When one's perceptual faculties engage the material world immediately, the result, a case of having an environmental state of affairs immediately present to one in experience, constitutes a justification for the associated perceptual claim. And this justification is not defeasible. If someone sees that P, it cannot fail to be the case that P. So the argument is not only not a priori justification, has to be and is indefeasible, also experience. The ordinary experience is, if it is justification, it is indefeasible justification. So Wright does not consider this possibility. Rather, he just repeats that reflection that already drives the argument from illusion. And I think this makes it clear that the blindness to the possibility must have a systematic cause, the cause that also drives the argument from illusion. So what drives the argument from illusion? John McDowell characterizes the presupposition of the argument from illusion as follows. It rests on the presupposition that the reason I have for a belief must be something of whose existence I can assure myself independently of knowing that the belief for which it is a reason is true. That is, in order for me to know P in virtue of a perception, I have to know that I perceive P independently of knowing P. Let us call this the independence condition for reasons, for beliefs. If this condition is valid, the so-called simple disjunctivist explanation of error would be impossible. For according to the disjunctivist explanation, my knowledge that P, acquired through perception, rests on my having a good sensory experience. And to this foundation, that is, that I perceive that P, I have no access independently of my knowing that my judgment that P is true. Because only if P is true can it be true that I perceive P. The disjunctivist explanation of error, therefore, conflicts with the condition of independence. I think there's a correct motive at the back, and I'm going to defend the disjunctivist solution in offering a model how to understand the refusal of this independence requirement. There is a correct motive at the basis of Wright's objection against the simple explanation. It is the idea that someone can only arrive at knowledge about the world on the basis of what she perceives if she knows that she is perceiving it. We are therefore looking for an explanation of perceptual knowledge that makes it intelligible how we can know something about the world in virtue of a perception, by explaining to us at the same time how we can know that we are perceiving that which we know in virtue of this perception. What we are looking for is an explanation of perceptual knowledge that is essentially self-conscious. That is, that implies that the subject of the knowledge is herself in a position to explain her knowledge rationally by citing her perception as a reason for her belief. Wright's objection against the disjunctivist account makes it clear that as long as we hold on to the independence condition for reasons, such an explanation is impossible as a matter of principle. In what follows, I will develop an explanation for perceptual knowledge that fulfills the demand stated above, in pointing toward a form of explanation that is as familiar to us as it is overlooked in contemporary epistemology. Therefore, the philosophical meaning of the disjunctivist conception of perception, I will argue, is only fully revealed once we appreciate it as an element of the thought that perceptual knowledge is a case to which this different form of explanation has to be applied. So I take it that disjunctivism is only a middle step in a much wider argument. Otherwise, it seems like just an ad hoc solution, which is barely intelligible. So what I take is what I'm going to say now is the deeper source for why, or a deeper argument why disjunctivism should or could be true at all, and why we should accept disjunctivism. So I will suggest that the idea of a rational sensory capacity to know is the idea of a kind of explanation that fulfills this demand. If this is correct, then it would mean that the fundamental case in which someone has a sensory experience is a case in which someone perceives something in virtue of which he or she immediately knows that he perceives. By putting the concept of a rational capacity to know, or a rational capacity for knowledge, at the center of our explanation of perceptual knowledge, we are referring to a philosophical tradition whose relevance for philosophical epistemology has, I believe, been at least underestimated. It is the tradition of Aristotle, Aquinas, Ryle, Wittgenstein, and Kenny, all of whom, with the exception of Wittgenstein, explicitly build on Aristotle's views about capacities. If this tradition is right, then the fundamental meaning of the concept of perception does not consist in the description of a single state, which should explain the presence of a belief, but in the description of something that is on a different logical level. Aristotle calls this something a dynamis, Aquinas calls it a potentia, Wittgenstein calls it a können, and Ryle and Kenny call it an ability or a capacity. So I will call it a capacity, more specifically a capacity to know or a capacity for knowledge. Of course, I'm not saying that this is, I'm not saying that none of the authors like Descartes, Locke or Hume or Russell and Ayer or then Sellers and Davidson didn't possess the category of a capacity. Of course, they all used that category all the time, and we all possess that category. We use it all the time. We describe ourselves constantly in terms of capacities. So what I want to say is that that this category is it has not been recognized as the fundamental concept of an account of perceptual knowledge, so it's more overly, it's like more a blind spot in epistemology, and not something that is, I'm not offering a new concept, something like that. So that's its philosophical importance has not been recognized. So let us begin with some general considerations about capacities. Aristotle comes upon the idea of dynamis in connection with the question of how a certain kind of change is to be explained. How it is to be explained, for example, that something that is first cold is then warm, or something that is first sick is then healthy. And the main feature by which Aristotle defines dynamis is that it is a principle of explanation. If we say that a thing has a dynamis, we endow it with a certain form of explanation, with something that explains certain changes in this thing itself or in another thing. Think of wood, for example. Let us imagine a given piece of wood is burning. What explains the change in the piece of wood while it is burning? Well, that the given piece of wood is burning is due to the fact, Aristotle says, that wood has the power to be burned. The power of wood to be burned explains why the wood is burning. So Aristotle talks in this context of a passive dynamis. What exactly does that mean? When we say that wood burns, we obviously do not make a statement about something that is happening here and now. We are not saying that something is in a certain state at a certain time. We are making a statement that goes beyond the states of an object here and now. Nevertheless, statements about capacities and dispositions refer intrinsically to temporally located states or actions, namely to those that manifest the capacities. So the statement wood burns gives us an explanation of certain events of a given piece of wood, namely of episodes of burning. So let us call this the Aristotelian doctrine. A dynamis is something general that stands in an explanatory relation to the cases that fall under the concept of the dynamis. And it does so in such a way that these cases are fully and immediately explained in virtue of the dynamis. Aristotle says, I quote, "The same logos of a dynamis explains a thing and its privation, only not in the same way, for the logos applies to one object in virtue of that object's nature and to the other, in a sense, accidentally." So, there are two objections to the Aristotelian idea that capacities and dispositions have an explanatory character. So we are now at paragraph 6, two objections against capacities. So the first objection is discussed by Ryle. The objection is that the reference to capacities and dispositions is not philosophically enlightening. On closer inspection, it turns out that talking about capacities is nonsensical. Because capacities, we said, are not states that can be located in time and space, but something general that goes beyond space and time. But that means, so the objection goes, that they are nothing real. But if they are nothing real, what should they then be? Ryle argues, the objection presupposes that statements like Peter can swim, wood burns, sugar is soluble, have the function, just like the statements about states and acts, of describing facts, which are distinct from the former in that they exist, I quote, in a sort of limbo world. Ryle objects, not all meaningful indicative statements are statements about the existence or occurrence of things. It is false to believe that statements about dispositions and capacities can have an explanatory character only if they describe certain things located in space and time. The explanation of one occurrence by another is just one kind of explanation. However, we are familiar with another kind of explanation, the explanation of occurrences by a law. So the law of gravity explains why the stone in my hand falls to the ground when I let go of it. The same law explains why my bike falls on its side when I let go of it. It is one and the same law that is at work in these cases and explains them. So I take Ryle's insight is that we can make sense of capacities when we realize that they are in a certain respect similar to laws. If we say that sugar dissolves in water, then we are thereby saying that we have an explanation of why that piece of sugar which we have put in water is dissolving. And if we say that Eva can ride a bike, we are saying that we have an explanation of why she's pushing down the right leg on the pedal and then the left leg and then again right and then again the left, etc. The explanation is her capacity to ride a bike. And we refer to that capacity as that which is the law for what she does. So, however, a second objection now arises against this explanation. Aristotle discusses this second objection, and among others, Goodman and Sellers have discussed this objection in contemporary philosophy. In contrast to the first objection, the second objection admits that talking about capacities does have an explanatory meaning. However, so the claim, that explanation is not complete, even though this is what it should be according to the Aristotelian doctrine. A dynamis, says Aristotle, explains the case that falls under it completely and immediately. But now we look at the following cases. Someone puts a sugar cube in water, but it does not dissolve. The sugar cube was wrapped in aluminium foil. Or someone has the sensory appearance of a ball lying in front of him, but does not know thereby that there is a ball lying in front of him. There is no ball lying in front of him, there is a mirror that reflects a ball lying behind him. So what is common to both cases can be described thus. In both cases, the act that the capacity explains does not come about, even though the antecedent of the conditional statement by which one could describe the capacity was fulfilled in both cases. The solubility in water of the sugar can be described by the conditional, if one puts sugar in water, it dissolves. And the capacity to know objects in virtue of sensory experiences can be described by the conditional, if one has the sensory appearance of an object, one thereby knows it. Aristotle calls cases like the ones above privative cases. They are cases that fall under the capacity insofar as the antecedent of the conditional that describes them is fulfilled, but in which nevertheless their actualization does not come about. The cases show that so the objection goes that capacities do not completely explain their acts. In such an explanation, we have to include the additional claim that there are favorable circumstances for the actualization of the capacity. So what explains the actualization of the capacity is not the capacity, but the capacity and the fact that circumstances are favorable for its actualization. So, but now let us ask, what puts us in a position to determine those circumstances that we qualify as favorable and unfavorable? What allows us, for example, to describe a case in which we strike a match, but in which it does not ignite, by saying it does not ignite because there are unfavorable circumstances, because it's wet. In fact, such an explanation contains an implicit reference to the case in which the capacity is actualized and which is completely explained by the capacity. This is so because independently of such a case, that is, a case which we understand in such a way, we cannot form the concept of favorable or unfavorable circumstances, which we can then use to say of cases that they do fall under the disposition or the capacity, although the capacity is not actualized because of unfavorable circumstances. There is no other way of explaining the concept of unfavorable circumstances than by saying that they are those circumstances that prevent the capacity from being actualized. And this implies that the capacity completely explains its actualization in those cases in which there are no unfavorable circumstances. So the so-called favorable circumstances can therefore not be added as a further additional element to the explanation of the positive case, but have to be contained already in our understanding of a disposition or a capacity. So if we follow Aristotle, then the above cases do not show that capacities do not give complete explanations. Instead, they show something about the kind of explanation capacities give. A capacity is an explanation that depends on circumstances. Therefore, Aristotle says we need not, in order to explain a given actualization of a power, to add the qualification if nothing external prevents it. For, he goes on, the bearer of a capacity has the power insofar as this is a power of acting, and it is this not in all circumstances but on certain conditions, among which will be the exclusion of external hindrances. So Aristotle wants to say that someone who has a power is, for conceptual reasons, dependent on specific circumstances in order to exercise this power. And because of this, it is superfluous, because tautological, to add such an explanation with the qualification if nothing external prevents it, because that is already included. But if this is so, then we finally can solve the problem with which we started. We started out with the problem that it seems impossible for us to have immediate consciousness of material objects if at the same time we want to account for the idea that we can be mistaken in our judgments about material objects. The two ideas did not seem to go together. The possibility of immediate consciousness seemed to be incompatible with the possibility of error. Our reflections on capacities, however, not only show us a way to combine the two, but also how both form a unity. For if capacities are general explanations that depend on circumstances, then it is part of the concept of a capacity that two kinds of cases fall under it. Those which the capacity explains immediately and completely, positive cases, and those where unfavorable circumstances obtain that explain why the realization of the capacity fails, the privative cases. So if we apply our reflections about capacities through the idea of perceptual knowledge, we arrive at the following view. Someone who knows something by means of the senses exercises his capacity to know something by means of the senses. This does not exclude, but rather contains the idea that there can be cases in which he has a sensory experience without knowing something by way of it, for example, if he is hallucinating. According to the considerations above, if we understand the concept of perceptual knowledge as the concept of capacity, the relation between cases of knowing and cases of error is such that there is an explanatory asymmetry between them. Perceptual knowledge is that case which is immediately and completely explained by the capacity. Error, by contrast, is the privative case explained by particular circumstances which account for the failure in the actualization of the capacity in this case. Perceptual knowledge is essentially fallible. That means that someone may think he knows something by means of the senses without that being the case. Why is that so? According to the Cartesian model, the fallibility of our perceptual knowledge is grounded in a kind of incapacity. The incapacity to enjoy sensory experience that establish the truth of our judgments. Because sensory experience cannot in principle establish truth, it seems error is a possibility that is always present and that we, as a matter of principle, can never exclude. By contrast, the capacity conception of perceptual knowledge rejects the idea of such an incapacity. The fallibility of our knowledge is not the expression of an incapacity, but an irreducible aspect of a capacity, the capacity to know how things are through sensory experience. For it belongs, as we have seen, to the idea of such a capacity that its exercise depends on favorable circumstances. But this dependence is not the source of an incapacity, namely to have truth-guaranteeing reasons, but on the contrary, the character of a fallible capacity. Now let us in conclusion return to Wright's objection. His objection was that the simple explanation of error of the capacity conception of perceptual knowledge presupposes that I can know, at least in some cases, that I have a good sensory experience, not a bad one. For only then can it explain how my experience provides me with knowledge. But because I'm unable to distinguish good and bad experiences by a criterion, if error is to be possible, I cannot know the quality of my sensory experience. We now see that one can make this objection only if one denies from the outset that one can know something by having the capacity to know something. Right demands that one has to be able to know whether one has a good or a bad sensory experience. That is correct. But he overlooks the explanation of how one can know this, given above. What explains this knowledge is, again, the capacity to know through sensory experience. After our reflections above, what we need in order to understand how someone can know that he has a good sensory experience and is not the victim of an illusion, the only thing we need is the idea that he has the capacity for sensory knowledge and that this capacity is a self-conscious capacity. That means the capacity to know that concerns us is not just any capacity to know, a capacity that animals, for example, can also have, but a specific capacity to know. A capacity whose exercise results in acts of which the subject of this capacity, in virtue of there being acts of this capacity, knows these acts. For this is what defines a self-conscious capacity, that its subject has a consciousness, an understanding, a concept of this capacity, so that she, in virtue of having the capacity, is in a position to explain acts that fall under this capacity by reference to this capacity. When I say, I know that there is a cup of tea in front of me, for I see it, then I am stating a basis of my knowledge that is not accessible to me independently of the knowledge in question. That I see a cup is something I do not know independently of knowing that there is a cup. The objection against this explanation was that it is circular. But it only seems circular as long as one does not see that the sentence, because I see it, does not describe an occurrence that is to explain another occurrence. That is my knowledge. So here I see it, and here my knowledge, and this occurrence has the function to explain this other occurrence, my knowledge. Rather, the sentence, because I see it, brings a form of explanation into play which is not an explanation of one occurrence by another, but an explanation of an occurrence by something general, a self-conscious capacity. That I know that there is a cup of tea in front of me, I know in the end because I have the capacity to know through sensory experience how things are. So the final kind of explanation that I'm referring to with saying because I see it is not to be understood under the model of I explain one occurrence with another occurrence, and then the objection would be, but if the one occurrence is only available to me presupposing the other, then this seems to be a circular explanation. And I'm saying that to see that if I say because I see it, this because points to the capacity that is the source of the explanation in that case. We said above that in order to refute Freud's objection, we need an account of perceptual knowledge that explains both how one can know by means of the senses that there is a cup in front of one, and how one can know that one perceives the cup, and explains this in a way that makes room for our liability to error. The account we have given accomplishes this. Both acts of knowledge are possible as acts of a self-conscious capacity to know by means of the senses how things are. This does not exclude the possibility of error, but includes it, because the capacity is fallible. So what is fallible is the capacity, not the justification. But if things go well and one sees what is the case, one thereby knows what is the case. So sensory experience provides a subject with knowledge. If, perceiving something, I judge it to be the case, the ground of my judgment establishes its truth. But because my capacity for sensory perception is fallible, This does not exclude, but includes that there can be cases in which I do not perceive, but merely believe that I am perceiving, and therefore merely believe myself to have a ground for my judgment that establish its truth without, in fact, having such a ground. And those are the cases of error. So we have shown that perceptual error presupposes a capacity to know by means of the senses how things are. Thus, immediate consciousness of material objects is not impossible, as Ayer believes, but consists in the exercise of a capacity which every one of us acquires who grows up in the vicinity of material objects and is provided with examples and training, as Wittgenstein says, by those who already have the relevant capacity. Thanks a lot.
It's a very difficult topic. Now I was looking at this Aristotle's quote, and I sort of like it. Actually, I think it's maybe the first step towards the understanding of what constitutes a scientific method or epistemological grounds of scientific method. I'll explain that in a second. And I think these objections you raised here, or you listed here, they are good objections only if we treat perceptual error in a very specific way and look at very specific examples. So, for example, I compare these color of these two bottles, and let's suppose I don't distinguish green and red, and this is green, this is red, then how do I know that this is green and this is red? I'm in error that both of them are red. But in some sense, and that's something that came up and became very important in the 17th century. My perceptual judgments or my perception is always in error in a very, very tangible way. So, for example, when I'm looking at this cup, I have a perception of a cup, believing it's a cup, but it's not really a cup. It's a bunch of electrons and atoms. It's really an empty space with just a little bit of particles that whiz by very, very quickly. So what I'm really perceiving is an appearance or a sort of an illusion of sorts. And in that sense, we are in error all the time. Now, what's interesting and what sort of is the basis of scientific methodology, we can actually compare these errors. So, illusion of a pink elephant in this room can be compared to the illusion of a spoon being bent in water, or an illusion of a spoon being a solid object, which is really not. And then, really, that's the basis of comparing these illusions is what scientists really do. In a way, they assume it's all these perceptual judgments are really incorrect, but let's compare them. And I'll just give an example, how it really works, or how I think it works in science. So, they see in the cloud chamber, they see some tracks. One group of physicists will say, oh, really, it's a particle that sort of whizzed by, and we just have this illusion of a track, that as something continuous. Others will say, no, it's actually a big wave, and this is only a kind of a trace of a wave. So the dilemma is which account can work in other cases. So they will compare different illusions in order to come up with a theory, but they will not really presume that we know as a matter of sort of immediate knowledge anything based on the perception. And I think Aristotle is kind of, well, maybe he doesn't go that far. It's really the first step to tell us that knowledge really doesn't lie in this immediate kind of perception that we want as a response to skeptic, but in terms of connecting different perceptions in particular ways. Not how clear was this, but
yeah. So I mean, there were many things that you said, and I'm probably won't be in a position to address them all. But let me take one that I
actually contradicting what you said at the end. I mean, it depends how you formulate it. But.
Yeah, but I think there was one element in your comment which seems interesting and which I haven't addressed. It's the idea that we could assimilate two kinds of error, and the one kind of error was the one that I only addressed in this paper, which is having an illusion of a pink elephant, having the illusion of a stick being bent, which is not bent, etc. The kind of error that you mentioned was an error that the application of our everyday concepts, like concept of a cup, color concepts, etc., as such is already an error, and I haven't addressed that kind of idea at all. And I think that to address that kind of thought, that is that what we really see are only molecules, whatever, and needs a different treatment as the kind of theory that I have stated here, because that idea seems to challenge the status of our everyday concepts, color concepts, and concepts of material objects that we all possess. And in order to, so that's a question about let's put it that way, the ontological primacy of our everyday concepts versus the concepts of the scientific worldview, or as you might call it. And I think that, so in order to address that and to say that what we see are cups and not molecules, one would have to argue that the concept of molecules, etc., is dependent on our understanding of concepts like a cup, etc. So I think that I wouldn't. So I would refuse to assimilate these two kinds of errors, or these conceptions of errors. In this case, so because the idea that I was trying to establish was to say that we have to get an idea why there is a logical and an explanatory asymmetry between perception and error.